Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here. Hi, guys. As Sarah said, I'm Dr. Frances Sivakoff. I'm a new assistant professor in the Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology department at OSU. And what I thought I'd talk about today is some of my favorite stuff in ecology, namely species interactions. And so since tonight's theme is pollinators, I thought about talking about a very important interaction, the interaction between plants and pollinators. And I think it's especially appropriate that we're here at the Meadery, because I've recently learned that mead is made of fermented honey, which our bees are responsible for. So what I hope that you'll take away from today's talk is just a new fun fact maybe that you didn't know about. I'm going to cover a lot of information, probably at a pretty, hopefully approachable level, but hopefully you'll learn something new. So what is a mutualism? This is taking me back, if many of you have been in introductory biology or introductory ecology. A mutualism is a type of species interaction where both parties benefit. So it's a win-win for our two interacting species. So what I want you to think about when we talk about a mutualism between plants and pollinators is kind of put yourself in the place of both of those players. So how do our pollinators benefit? How do our plants benefit? At the very end of the talk, we'll kind of come back to this question and we'll think about it's kind of when conditions change and both parties in the interaction aren't quite getting the same thing out of it where they started from, does that great relationship, the mutualism, break down? So first let's talk about our plants. How do our plants benefit from this close relationship with our pollinators? And so what I thought we'd do, and actually I'm really glad Andrew covered a bit of this in the first talk of the evening, is to kind of just refresh what is pollination. So pollination, as Andrew mentioned, is when the male gametes from a plant are transferred to the female part of a hopefully different plant, although not always. And ultimately, fertilization results. So what I thought I'd do is just throw up here a little diagram of a common flower. What's neat about pollination, just as a little side note, is that it brings together all sorts of fields of study. I myself am an entomologist by training. Ecologists, animal behavior folks, and botanists all come together to study this topic. So what I've learned kind of in my pursuits of insect-plant interactions are botanists love the vocabulary terms. So you will learn all sorts of crazy terms, including, important for this talk, is that the male part of the flower, the part that holds the pollen, aka the male sperm, are generally found in these parts of the flowers known as the anthers. And the female part of the flower is known as this pistil, is the whole thing, but we often see the stigma when we are just looking if we find a flower on the roadside. And so what happens in pollination is that pollen grains coming from an anther are deposited on the stigma of, as I said, hopefully a different flower. A pollen tube, it grows and ultimately fertilizes the eggs in the ovaries, and eventually a fruit or fertilized zygote develops. So this is a close-up picture of one of those anthers, and each of those tiny little grains are pollen grains. This time of year, we all know pollen pretty well if we walk around outside, and some of us might have allergies. So maybe pollen isn't our favorite thing, but plants send them out in a variety of different ways. The pollen that we interact with as we're walking down the street, that's wind-pollinated pollen. So many plants try and spread their seed via wind. Might not be our favorite. But many plants, the numbers vary a little bit, but a common number is about 75% of plants actually rely on animals to move pollen among flowers. And so this close-up picture of a bee, you can see all over its little hairy body, including its adorable little face, you can tell I'm an insect person, are covered with this yellow pollen. And so why should we care about bees? And again, this was covered a little bit in the previous talk as well. Well, I already mentioned that 75% of plants rely on animals to move for reproduction, but about 35% of the foods that we eat are reliant on pollination as well. So what you can see in this image here is breakfast with the bees on the left and without the bees on the right. So audience participation, bonus points. Can anybody tell me why the creamer is not present on the right? Any guesses? Yeah?
Because the food source for the cows?
Yes! Ding, 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 bonus points. So that's exactly right. So alfalfa, which is a common feed for cows, is pollinated. So we wouldn't have that dairy to lighten up our coffee without those bees as well. So I think actually I don't have to say too much to this audience to convince you that our pollinators are important. And I guess I should make the distinction, I think I'm going to do this right here on the next slide, is that given my background as an insect ecologist, it's not surprising that when I say pollinator, oftentimes I do mean bee. But in fact, there are between 100 and 200,000 species of animals that act as pollinators. So not just bees are important for pollination. In fact, other insects, other hymenoptera, like wasps, can be pollinators. Other flying insects, like Lepidoptera, like our butterflies and moths, are very important pollinators. Monarch butterflies are a particular interest of mine, and they are covered under the former president's initiative to increase pollinators. And then as we expand into more and more diverse types of insects, flies, beetles are important pollinators. And then we can start thinking about animals that aren't insects, including bats, geckos, and even lemurs and other mammals can be pollinators. They can move, basically, when we talk, again, reminding the pollinators here are just organisms that move pollen from flower to flower. So all of these organisms do that, whether they intend to or not. So we've covered already how plants benefit from this tight interaction. Now let's talk a little bit about why do pollinators do it? Are they doing it out of the goodness of their heart? Are they doing it because they don't intend to? In fact, plants have wised up over evolutionary time, and they have provided a variety of sweet floral rewards to our pollinators. So the pollinators get a lot out of these interactions as well. And there are two major floral rewards. There are other things that bees get out of this as well, but that's for another talk. And those floral rewards are, on the left, you can see this moth going for some sweet nectar. So nectar acts as a sugar source for our pollinators, and also a source of important amino acids for their diet. And then on the right, you see the sweat bee collecting pollen. Pollen, as I mentioned, is actually a very interesting player in this equation, because as I mentioned, it is it holds the male gametes that are important for reproduction, but these pollinators actually use that pollen as well as a food source. So the pollen acts as an important source of protein and lipids in their diet. So there's a ton of, flowers produce a ton of pollen, enough so that it can fulfill its objective for reproduction and have extra to spare for feeding the pollinators that do the work for it. But we'll get back to when plants are stingy with their pollen, let me say. So some of plant-pollinator interactions are so interesting to me for several reasons. But one of the reasons why they're so interesting is because these sort of interactions have been tightly coupled for a very long time. And when two species are heavily reliant on each other and exist in close relationship for a very long time, coevolution or reciprocal change between the two organisms can occur. So what I've put up here, and I guess the citation has been cut off a little bit, but it was a 2004 kind of paper summarizing a variety of different examples of coevolution of plants and pollinators in the literature. And this is a really nice one. It doesn't involve our insect friends, but it is another important pollinator. These are honey creeper birds. And then this species of flower here is I think one of the most common endemic species to the Hawaiian Islands. And it's a really interesting example of when these two forms match each other so closely. So most startling, you'll notice the corolla tube, another vocab word for botany if you're keeping track, of this cyanna flower is incredibly long and curved. And interestingly, it matches the beaks of these honey creeper birds. So this is a case where for these honey creepers to be successful at feeding on these flowers, they adapted their beak shape to match those tubes. So that's talking about coevolution in an interesting bird example. Well, now let's get back to the main event, our insects, and what evidence do we have in terms of coevolution for them? And so we actually have fossil evidence dating back from the early Cretaceous period indicating that insects were utilizing plant resources. Specifically, we have fossils indicating that the wing morphology and some other morphology of these beetles matches certain traits that we see in modern day pollinators. So that gives us evidence that suggests that beetles and actually flies were starting this early association with angiosperms, which is the more technical name for flowering plants. And it was in the late Cretaceous period, actually, where we saw the evolution of nectaries in these flowering plants. And that really marks the start of when Hymenoptera, our bees and our wasps, started having this close association, this mutualistic relationship with flowering plants. So now I want to talk a little bit about these different ways in which flowering plants and insect pollinators have adapted to get the most out of these relationships, right? So we talked about how both players in this interaction benefit. Now let's talk a little bit about some of their features that make them more successful. So for instance, plants have a variety of different adaptations that make them more attractive to pollinators, and that not only attract pollinators, but attract the right pollinators. So remember a few slides ago, I showed you a whole bunch of pictures of different pollinators, some of which were more specific, had more fidelity to certain flowers than others, which is really important because if you are a plant and need someone to send your pollen to the right place, you don't want some other organism that's going to dilly-dally around and going to every other species. You want something that's going to do the job. So there are not only things to attract general pollinators, there are adaptations that plants have to attract the right pollinators. So plants can have certain fragrances that make them attractive to pollinators. They can have colorful petals, as you see on the image on the right here. And in fact, I found this really an interesting fact. Specific colors attract different kinds of pollinators. So for instance, generally flowers that are blue and yellow are attractive to bees. Flowers that are orange and red, attractive to butterflies. And flowers that are white are more attractive to moths. So if you're thinking about suggestions for plantings in your yard and you want to have a particular kind of pollinator be more abundant, keep those colors in mind for the flowers. Also, I think that generally these colors are attractive for certain types of organisms based on the visual spectrum that they can see, those organisms can commonly see. Another thing that plants do to attract pollinators are these things called nectar guides. And I bold that here because that's kind of what I'm what's illustrated in this picture here. And again, the reference is cut off, but this is a 2012 publication by Kuta et al. And nectar guides are really what they sound like. It's basically like hit it here signs for our pollinators, almost like runways. Please come here to our pollinators. So you can see them basically pointing to the nectaries, which are found very close to the reproductive structures of our plants. Another really neat thing about plants that you may or may not know is that they sometimes have colors that we as humans in our limited visual spectra cannot see. Namely, they often utilize UV colors to attract pollinators. Very cool, right? So pollinators have a different eyesight than you and I and can actually see in UV. Plants take advantage of that and actually put out UV colors to attract those plants. So for instance, what's super neat is that a plant that may seem monochromatic to us actually is patterned in UV. Not all plants are like this, but certainly we can find many, many examples of patterns that we can only see with a UV camera. And I hope to start doing some of this work actually this summer, looking at some of these UV patterns. And so again, the coloration that we see in UV, you can see that the tips of these anthers, these male parts of the flower, are white. And then we have a dark, almost bullseye sign pointing to those anthers, those floral parts. So really neat plant adaptations that are all around us, but that we don't see commonly. So now let's talk about pollinator adaptations. So I just have a couple of these listed. Pollinators are trying to what I like to think about and why I think species interactions are so interesting is I almost try and get in the head of each of the players. What are their goals here? Their goals are to survive, get enough food to survive, and to reproduce. So organisms like our pollinators here are trying to have, those most successful have adaptations that make them best at those things. So for instance, two pollinator adaptations that you may commonly see as you see honeybees around are the ability to collect these two kinds of floral rewards that I mentioned, namely the nectar and the pollen. So for instance, you can see that many insect pollinators, honeybees especially, have these adaptations on their legs, and other pollinators have it on the underside of their abdomen, that allow them to collect that pollen. So this particular feature on honeybees is called a pollen basket. And what it is, not actually a basket, but a series of specially modified hairs that allow for the pollen to be picked up and really collected, ultimately to be brought to the hive for the other honeybees to use, but could inadvertently be transferred from flower to flower, which would be beneficial for our flowers. And the other thing that honeybees have as an adaptation is this thing called a honey stomach. And this was new to me as I researched this talk, but, you know, and it actually is particularly appropriate being here at the Meadery, which is so reliant on honey. But when honeybees harvest the nectar from the flowers, it's not the finished honey product that we see here at the Meadery. In fact, bees need to do some modifications both from digestive enzymes and through some evaporation behavior back at the hive to concentrate that nectar solution into the honey that we recognize. So that first step of the digestive enzymes working on that nectar occurs in that honey stomach of the honeybee here. And I think it's a little hard to see, but other entomologists tell me that you can see the honey stomach if you see kind of a distended or hard stomach on the honeybee. It suggests that there is a full nectar belly, as you will. So our honeybees have evolved these adaptations to take advantage of these floral rewards. Now I want to get into an interesting point, namely, and actually Andrew touched on this a little bit, that the idea that not all pollinators are created equal from the perspective of the plants. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting because both parties in the interaction are trying to maximize what they get out of it. And sometimes if the pollinator isn't living up to its end of the bargain, the plant starts looking elsewhere. And so, for instance, there are several types of plants that need to be pollinated by specialized pollinators that do something called buzz pollination. Buzz pollination, and this is my second ever GIF, by the way, please enjoy. But buzz pollination occurs when a very high frequency sonication causes the plant to release its pollen. And so, has anybody ever used or seen like a Sonicare toothbrush, like a vibrating toothbrush? That's what I think of when I think of sonication, a very quick vibration. And essentially, that's what this tuning fork is doing. The high frequency sonication is acting as a cue for the anther to release its pollen. And actually, it's not as dramatic as I would have hoped. I think it's just about the quality of the GIF, but you can sort of see, watch this, the tip of the petal here. That's where the pollen is falling. Okay, good, I'm seeing some nods. It's not completely lost. So in order for that pollen to be released, it needs that buzzing. And interestingly, honeybees, our most commonly used pollinator, can't do it. And it's really important for many of the crops that we find so absolutely tasty, including tomatoes, potatoes, and blueberries. So I like to talk about buzz pollination just from the perspective that all pollinators are not created equal, and I think that the previous talk made a really nice plug for the importance of certain types of pollinators, including native pollinators, that can do this sort of buzz pollination. Not all pollinators are created equal. The plant is left with a conundrum. If I could just anthropomorphize plants for a minute and say, put my little plant's hat on, and if I was a plant, this is what I would be thinking. Well, I need this particular type of pollinator to spread my seed, And so what I can do is kind of be choosy about who can access it. We saw with the buzz pollination a really good example of, only the pollen is only released when a certain feature is in place. But I want to talk to you about a second feature, namely, some plants are choosy with who gets the floral rewards by having slightly complex morphology. So this is something that we're doing in my lab this summer. We're working with this beautiful plant here on the right called Lotus corniculatus. And lotus is in the bean family. It is very interesting because it has what we call complex floral structure. And again, I do want to qualify this by saying I am not a botanist, so this is my 2 cents interpretation of what's going on here. But what I want to show you is this flower on the left in contrast. So this flower on the left is a more simple or open pollen structure where you can see the anthers of the plant, and the pollen is basically just presented. It's just hanging out there. And so anything can go by and access that pollen. But problematic, as I mentioned before, is that sometimes that pollen is wasted and not effectively transferred to a conspecific plant or another plant of the same species. Lotus here on the right is different in that it hides its floral structures away inside this kind of package called the keel. So the lotus flowers, and you'll see here, pardon me for a moment, we're going to get a little botany. What we have here is a dissected picture of a flower in the pea family that is similar to lotus, but not exactly the same. And these flowers have 5 petals. A big, beautiful banner petal, also known as the standard petal, and then 4 smaller petals, 2 keels and 2 wings that make up this keel structure that hides the reproductive parts of the plant. So if you remember way back to that first couple of slides, the stamens are the male parts of the plants that hold those anthers. And those pollen grains that are on the tips of these anthers are hiding away in that keel plant. So this is where it gets a little PG-13, so I'm really glad that we are here at the 21 plus institution. And I wanted to give you just a little cross-section of what was going on in these keel blossoms. And so what is happening here, this is from a publication by Westerkamp in 1997. I don't know if he coined the term or if someone else coined the term, but essentially he calls the reproductive structures here the sexual column. So the sexual column is hiding away inside these keel blossoms, and the nectar, essentially what our pollinators are looking for as their sweet reward, is found at the base of the sexual column, at this nectar access hole. So this is really neat. The pollinators, okay, and I wanted to just show you this quick image just to relate what the actual lotus flowers look like related to this cartoon image. This beautiful petal right here, that's our standard petal. And this structure that almost looks like a Dutch clog shoe, that's our keel. The nectary is at the very base of this standard petal. And so I'm going to show you my first ever GIF right now. This is a megachilid bee accessing that nectar reward in our lotus flowers. And what you can see here is that the bee has inserted its mouth parts at the base of that standard petal. It's going for that nectar, but it's doing this funny motion where it's almost pumping the keel of the flower. And then I also want you to notice what the flower is doing with that pump. So, again, apologies for the grainy quality, but there's this small tip that comes out at the bottom of that pump. And what that is, do folks see that? So what that is, that's the tip of those anthers. That's the pollen being presented at the base of that pump up and down. So it's only with that motion that the pollen is presented to the bee. So what the flower is essentially ensuring is that a pollinator needs to be able to do that motion, almost like know the secret password to unlock that pollen from that flower. So I love good stories about amazing things that we can find in biology, and I think this is a really cool adaptation that these plants have evolved to ensure that their pollen is transferred and not wasted to the right organism. So largely, I have shown you a love story this evening in my talk, namely this beneficial relationship between our plants and our pollinators. I wanted to just end by talking about when that relationship goes sour. So there are just a couple of things, and again, this is why I find plant-insect interactions so interesting, or these type of species interactions so interesting. They exist at a delicate balance where both sides are living up to their end of the bargain. But when one side doesn't, the relationship goes south. And so a couple of examples of when mutualistic relationships can change to antagonistic relationships where one side benefits and the other does not and is harmed are here. So this image on the left, this is a bumblebee that is doing a strange behavior where it is actually slicing a hole in the base of the flower and stealing the nectar. This is called nectar robbing, and it's pretty it's a common enough behavior that it occurs not only in bumblebees but in some other species of insects and even other orders of organisms. And what happens in nectar robbing is the bee still gains the benefit of having the delicious nectar, but the plant no longer gets its pollen transferred by the pollinator or by the animal eating the nectar, no longer moving pollen, because it does not access those plant parts that kind of sneak the pollen onto its body. The plant is no longer benefiting. So in that relationship, we think about, the insect pollinator is still winning, but our plant no longer benefiting. And so I need to look into this a little bit further, but I think plants are coming up with ways to kind of counter-evolve to prevent that kind of nectar robbing from occurring. The other example I want to talk about is something that we can actually see here in the greenhouse at Columbus. And so I thought it was kind of an interesting example. Does anybody know what this is? What is it? It's a corpse flower, that's right. This is a flower that flowers not pretty infrequently. I think a flowering event is a pretty big deal. But what's absolutely super interesting, besides its really interesting shape and morphology, is that it stinks to high heaven. Like, it smells like, as its name suggests, it smells like a corpse. And plants are a little bit sneaky in this way, because what the flowers that sometimes put out odors to attract insects that are attracted to carrion. So for instance, certain flies and certain beetles will fly to these bad-smelling flowers, anticipating some sort of host for their young, some sort of dead thing, and be very disappointed that it is just a pretty flower. And the flower can then benefit if that fly or beetle inadvertently picks up pollen and moves it elsewhere. So in that case, we're dealing with an interaction where our plant benefits and our insect vector, thing that will move things from place to place, does not. Interestingly, I read about an example in an extreme case where the insect is so confused that it actually lays its eggs on the plant, and the hatched young will die because it does not have that delicious carrion meal to develop on. So, another case of a mutualism gone south. So I'm going to end it there. I hope I've shared with you some things you may or may not have known about plant-insect interactions. I think it's a super interesting story, and I'm always happy to chat about it. I've got my name, email, and website up there, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.